Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to another installment of the School of Architecture and Planning's 2018-2019 Fall Lecture Series. I'm glad you could join us. We have a very interesting discussion today and guest speaker, and I will introduce that person in a second. For some of you who have been coming, you know that we've had a fairly full schedule throughout the semester of interesting lectures on different topics, and I just want to plug an upcoming lecture, and there's a poster up there by Jeremy Cargan. Blue, it's landscape, reads left to right, right to left to right. And the next lecture that we'll have is on Monday, October 15th at 5 p.m., so not a Wednesday, but a Monday, and it's with Alex Garvin and Charlie Duff, and the topic is what makes a great city. So all planners, all architects, all landscape architects, anyone who's interested in cities and American cities in general, or Baltimore, should come. Again, that's Garvin and Duff, what makes a great city, Monday, October 15th. Of course, we have a really nice program today, and I'm going to introduce our speaker. Our speaker today is Seema Iyer, and she's of Baltimore University, the Merrick School of Business, and within the Merrick School of Business, she is part of the Jacob France Institute, and she'll explain more about her work. She is Associate Director and Research Assistant Professor for the Jacob France Institute. And Dr. Iyer oversees the Baltimore Network Indicators Alliance, which is what she'll talk about today, which is, it's part of a lot of things, but it provides longitudinal community-based data on demographics, housing, crime, education, and sustainability. And we're all very interested in hearing about all of these subjects as they relate to Baltimore and other places. Dr. Iyer is a recognized expert on strategic planning and community development. Her research projects include the McElderry Park Burn Criminal Justice Innovation Plan. Did I get that place name right? You know, I'm not always great with my Baltimore place names. Okay, close enough. Regional Housing Plan for the Opportunity Collaborative, and an evaluation of Baltimore's Vacancy Value Program and verification work for the Baltimore Energy Initiative. She's also served as a consultant to the Baltimore Mayor's Office of Information Technology on the city's Open Data Program. She teaches in the undergraduate real estate and economic development program at the University of Baltimore. She teaches real estate principles and local economic development. In 2017, she was a Fulbright Nehru Scholar at the Indian Institute of Management in Bangalore, India, researching the role of master planning processes within changing urban governance networks. I could go on and on. She's been involved in a lot of things, and her affiliations are all very impressive. But I think her work will speak for herself and have this conversation. So it's my pleasure to introduce Seema.
Thank you so much for the invitation to be here. Very excited. How many are planning students? Architecture students? Okay. Thank you for being here. How many people live in Baltimore? All right, so we have some Baltimoreans here. So I always start off my talks like this because we are maybe planners, architects, just people who love Baltimore, but maybe we all understand gardening. Any gardeners in the room? Okay, I have this plant. There's a pretty obvious problem with this plant. It's got this yellow leaf that's not supposed to be yellow. If I don't know anything about gardening, what would you do to tell me to help this yellow leaf? And I don't want to prune it, I want to save it. What would I do?
You might want to adjust the water schedule.
Where would I put the water?
Probably in the saucer under the container.
Under the container, right? Any other solutions? Any other thoughts on how I save this leaf?
topic.
Jewish cultural tradition, they want to lift it up and wash it or something.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Israel.
So where you put the water, right, is in the soil or underneath the soil, right? The answer to this leaf's problem is not in the leaf, right?
Yeah.
You have to either give it more sunlight or add more nutrients to the soil. Well, we know this about plants, right? That when we see a plant failing, that it's because of the context that that plant is in that that plant might be failing. It's not the plant itself. Communities are the same thing. When we see what we might consider to be a failing community or a distressed community, it's not about the community itself. It's about the context that that community is in. And that's all about planning. And that's all about architecture. And that's all about the spaces that we live in. And that is what this talk is going to be about. How do we understand how to even follow what context even is? And is that something that we're even kind of really focusing in on the planning context? So what are neighborhoods? So what do we mean by context? If you haven't read Robert Sampson's Great American City, I would add it to the syllabus in case it's not here already. And it's this idea that the places that we live in have far more durable properties than we do as individuals or that we might even have as a community. And it's that durability of a space that we have to keep measuring and understanding, because the things that we try to do to impact our places that we live are in that context of the durability of the place itself. So what is your neighborhood? Think about where you live. Think about your address. What does your address give you? It gives you way more than where you hang your hat, right? Where you live determines who your neighbors are. Most of us don't choose our neighbors. They are our neighbors. We go into a context where our neighbors are. It's how your community might be organized, whether you have an HOA, whether you have some type of a community-based organization that's helping guide your neighborhood. You go into that. You exist in that already. It determines your services. Your address determines your school. It determines who represents you politically, whether you voted for them or not. And very much in a city like Baltimore, your address is determining your identity. It means something to live in Lauraville. It means something to live in Northwood. There's a history associated with that, and people take great pride in that fact. And unfortunately, which I'm going to talk a little bit about more in this talk, is that the places that we live are unfortunately incredibly tied to our health outcomes. More and more, your zip code is tied to your health outcomes than your genetic code. So your address is giving you that as well. The thing that I think maybe planners we don't talk too much about is that your address absolutely determines the market you're in, right? It determines your housing market. Whether or not you can buy or sell your house has way more to do with the location of your address than whether or not you put out the granite countertops and bump out the kitchen, right? You can do all that, but if you're not in the right place, you're not going to be able to sell your house. And then finally, retail is completely dependent on your address. We know this because of the aggregate demand that retailers are looking for when they put a brick and mortar store in a particular location. Grocery store is a retail store. The bank, the storefront bank, is a retail institution. And they are looking for aggregate demand, which your address is a part of. So if you have the benefit of being near a grocery store, it's not because you personally live there, it's because everyone around that grocery store, they're assuming is going to probably shop there. All this is wrapped up in your address. This is the bundle of goods that where we live affects us by. So we have to start actually measuring that bundle of goods so that you understand where you're sitting, right? What kind of soil and context and how is that changing, even though you yourself personally may or may not be affecting that. So that's what we do at the Baltimore Neighborhood Indicators Alliance. Very quickly, we are part of the National Neighborhood Indicators Partnership, which is a network of 36 cities that have similar projects like ours. So we're a learning network with other cities around the country that are similar to Baltimore in many ways, have distressed neighborhoods, and we're trying to keep track of it. So if you are interested in this broader topic of how do we measure this, the neighborhoodindicators.org is a good location of all kinds of learning materials. And we're after this thing called community-based indicators that, again, are there to try and measure place. It's the full gamut of economic, social, environmental, cultural resources in our neighborhood, and how can we quantify these things? And quantifying it is very challenging. We focus on existing data sets that exist in city agencies. And the point isn't that I'm going to get one data point in time. One data point in time doesn't tell you anything about trends, right? It just tells me about this one data point in time. But I want to know how communities change over time. And so I must get to things that have some periodicity, some frequency, some ability to follow whether things are going up, down. If I do something, is it changing the directionality of those trends? And so it's not necessarily the numbers that I'm going to tell you, it's how those numbers are changing over time that is much more important about understanding context of place. Like I mentioned, we collect data from all kinds of city-based agencies. That means that we're not generating any primary data, we're following what interactions the citizens are having with any institution in the city of Baltimore. Right? This is all about e-government. Any list that the government has that's curated into some electronic format is what we'll grab. And so every single one of these has a human story behind it. Even though it's data, you might not be a data person in this room, but every single data set that we have, somebody did something to get in that data set. And that's actually how we kind of think about the data even when we're analyzing it. Somebody had a baby to be in that vital statistics report. Somebody called 911. Somebody called 311. Somebody pulled a library card for their child, and now they're in our data set, right? So it's some interaction that we're having with an institution that creates this list. So there's a very human story behind every single data point that you're going to see. We get this data from, again, city-based agencies, and it's actually 90% of the work that we do is acquiring data from these agencies, understanding even why they're collecting this data, and it all comes from why the community even wants to use this data to begin with, and can it be actionable for them to, again, affect change in their neighborhood. And we put it out on the website. You're more than welcome to take a look at it at any digital level of capacity, whether you want to read a report, a physical report, whether you want to look at it interactively online, or whether you want to connect to it from the back-end API on our open data portal. We try and service all kind of needs of looking at this data in ways that you might use for your own purposes. We put it at this scale, which is called a community. The city's divided into 55 communities. Nobody likes boundaries. Any geographers in the room? All right, nobody likes boundaries. Everybody hates boundaries. No matter what a boundary I put on the city, they're gonna hate it. Well, this is our boundary, and I know people hate it. The good thing about the boundary is that it's consistent over time. It's been the same set of boundaries for now 18 years. That consistency is critical for analysis, right, for all of us. And they do follow census boundaries, so there's kind of a reason, some reasoning behind the boundaries. But the point of this is not zoomed in, right? Zoomed into the parcel level. We can go all the way into the parcel level. We know GIS people in the room, we know how to go all the way in, right? This is a slightly bigger scale, but obviously smaller than the city scale. And the point is that sometimes when you zoom in too far, things get very pixelated. And this provides a little bit of a picture away from kind of, why is my parcel not working? It's because your parcel is sitting in some context. So imagine each one of these communities is the soil that our neighborhoods are trying to function in, whether or not you see that or not, and this kind of illuminates that pattern for us. This is kind of the same idea that, you can have these individual, we have the data at this individual scale. This is vacancy on the left and vacancy on the right, which is the aggregated form of the same set of data, right? This is a way to look at spatial representation at different scales, and they both are valid. If you own this property, you're going to want to know if the property next door has an abandoned house notice on it. But what you really want to do is if you just fix one house in a sea of vacancy, that's not going to be enough. You want to know what scale we're talking about. And so looking at both scales is really important for communities to understand. Sometimes zooming in too far is actually not helpful. Zooming in a little bit, or kind of coming out a little bit is what is really needed. So that's the role of the Baltimore Neighborhood Indicator Science, is to provide that context. So we put out every year the Vital Signs Report. We've done it for 16 years. We put it out for the 55 communities, 150 indicators. We're very good at coming up with indicators. We know the sources, we know how to calculate it, but good Lord, 150 indicators per neighborhood per year for 16 years, that's a lot of data. Now, I love data, I'm a data geek, but the question is, especially after the unrest in the city of Baltimore in 2015, which some of you might have been here for, that was too much information. How do we cut to the chase? What do we really need neighborhoods to know? And so we actually boil it down to one indicator. One of all 150. I know my fellow colleagues and the faculty here might not know me saying this, but there's one indicator that matters the most for every neighborhood, and that's population change. So let's look at Baltimore from a kind of an East Coast perspective. This is 2000 to 2010. Baltimore City is the only city on the East Coast that lost population between 2000 and 2010. These are our comparable cities, right? All these cities lost population from the 1950s, which is where we started losing population. Philadelphia has been losing population, but it obviously has turned around in that last decade. This is, when we think about comparable cities, sometimes we think about Denver, and sometimes we think about, St. Louis. Those are not our comparable cities. We are sitting in the megalopolis region of the Northeast. These are the things that we need to focus in on. And if they turn themselves around, they also have stories of crime and poor education and all that stuff. New York City was kind of famous for this, and it's turned itself around. What is going on in Baltimore that we're not capturing what all these other East Coast cities are doing? So when you think about population change, it seems like such a simple thing. You do not need, I know you're all here getting degrees, master's degrees, but you actually don't need a master's degree to figure out population change, right? What's the population in time one, what's the population in time two, and make a subtraction, right? But the thing is that that one indicator is going to drive all the other things you're going to hear about in a neighborhood. If you're going into a neighborhood that's growing beyond kind of the average, and in the city of Baltimore, since we're losing 5%, any neighborhood that's growing is going to be beyond the average, what are you going to hear about? You're going to hear about congestion. These are the kinds of things that you hear about in a community planning context. You're going to hear about displacement, fears of gentrification. You're going to actually hear about increasing crime. Why? Because retail followed all of that population change, and retail is what begets crimes of opportunity, right? There's something to steal at that point. So the kinds of crimes that you hear about are those things where probably the perpetrator and the victim don't know each other. They're stealing something because there's something to steal. In our stable communities, a lot of Northeast Baltimore fits into what you might call stable. What are you going to hear about? Making sure things stay maintained, making sure things stay clean, making sure that the alleyways have the leaves and the trash picked up, making sure that the schools remain high quality so that people continue to move into your neighborhood. And things about maintenance. Can I maintain my house? Can I rehabilitate my house? Will somebody invest and continue to rehabilitate my house, even though I'm a pretty stable neighborhood? And what are you going to hear in declining neighborhoods? Number one indicator for a declining neighborhood is vacant and abandoned property. People leave, or people pass away, and they don't take their houses with them. And that's what you're going to see in a declining neighborhood, and everything that ensues beyond that. Illicit behavior around vacant and abandoned property. The violent kind of crime that happens in declining neighborhoods based on social networks at this point. Because we're contracting, right? You're contracting in terms of population, but you're not contracting in terms of space. There's still the same amount of infrastructure that fewer and fewer people now have to manage. This is where you hear about food deserts. The population goes, the retail goes with it. This is where you hear about school closing. Population goes, enrollment goes with it. It's all of those things confluence in what is the driving factor? That one simple, quote unquote, simple measure, population change. So this is population change in the city of Baltimore. You can see even though we were a losing city, we lost 5% population, not every neighborhood declined. You can see that spine going down the center all the way from north to south and going a little bit out to the east has growing neighborhoods. And then everything in red has been declining. Look at the entire west side of Baltimore. And what I have on top of it is councilmanic districts. The 9th district is the only one that had one kind of neighborhood, which is all population decline. But look at our other councilmen, or councilwomen. What do they hear? They have all kinds of neighborhoods. They have all three types. They hear every single issue when they go into their neighborhoods. And it's hard to keep track of which neighborhood needs which bundle of things that I mentioned before. We're not organized for, imagine if all the red neighborhoods in the city of Baltimore were organized politically and the things that they would ask for. If all the green neighborhoods were organized politically and the things that they would ask for, and all the yellow neighborhoods were organized. We don't come together to cross-fertilize ideas this way, and so that's what makes it really hard for certain policies to actually get implemented. So, simple indicator, right? Population change. How do you even know if your neighborhood is growing or not? So, how many people in this room think that you are in a growing neighborhood? How many think you're in a stable neighborhood? How many think you're in a declining neighborhood? Back me. How many have no idea? Okay. So we did this exercise with an audience that we had of about 100 people, and this is what they said. So most of you said either growing or stable, and the stalwart few said possibly declining. What's fascinating is that 12% had no idea. And that's actually probably true. We actually really don't know in our neighborhoods this very simple indicator. Are you growing or are you not? So, what our indicators are meant to do is to try and help us do that. How do we track since 2010, which is the best census data that we get at that small scale? What's been going on since then? So like I mentioned, the number one thing you look at is vacant and abandoned property. Obviously, if people are leaving, if your vacancy rate is going up, that means you're losing population. And so this is the one indicator that we tell people to look at. But this is the obvious indicator, right? It's the boarded up, code violated, can't live in it kind of house. So in 2011, we realized that we needed something else beyond that. And this is the indicator that we tell people to track, which is no longer receiving mail. When the post office sees that nobody's picked up the mail in 90 days in a particular address, they stop delivering, and that is the data set itself, where the post office is no longer delivering the mail. These are the less obvious from the outside, but every neighborhood knows these empty houses. You know which house is empty in your neighborhood, and you're not exactly sure why nobody's living in it, but this is kind of an indicator for that. Notice the pattern, right? You probably have this mental map in your mind. The vacancy is kind of really into that east-west Baltimore going up to Park Heights. The not receiving any mail, see how that comes out to the western part of Baltimore City? And remember that map of where we had all of western Baltimore was losing population? The housing stock out there looks okay, there's just nobody living in it, which is a problem. So let's look at the trend of both of these things. So this is vacant and abandoned property, and the top line, these are two different neighborhoods. The top line is Midway Cold Spring. So since 2010 up to 2016, you can see that it went from being around 17% vacant all the way up to 30. And another neighborhood that actually had a very similar beginning, Poppleton, which is on the east side, that started off at 18% vacancy and now is down to 12. These two neighborhoods just experienced two totally different trajectories, right? And if you've been to Midway Cold Spring versus Poppleton, you can see what that looks like, right? Poppleton has a lot of activity, around the biopark there. The citywide average is down here at the orange line, which is always going to be true when I show you these. The citywide average is orange. And this is what I mean by the tale of two Baltimores. You could have two different neighborhoods that look pretty similar, but they're on two different trajectories. So the same policy, the same kind of community planning process is not going to land in these two places the same way, because they are kind of on a different path. This is the one about percent receiving no mail. The top line is Greater Mondawmin, went from 12% to 20% almost. And the middle one is Washington Village, Big Town. Again, literally started at the same point in 2010, and now look at how different they are. What happened in Greater Mondawmin recently?
Target closed.
The Target closed, right? Why? We just lost 8% of the population there to on empty households. Those were the people that were patroning the Target. So this is literally an early warning sign that you're going to start losing other things that you care about because you're losing population. And this is the thing that we were suggesting that Greater Mondawmin pay attention to. Why are these houses empty? Because if those houses are empty, you're going to lose everything else that you care about, like that Target. So this is what the Vital Signs Report is meant to do, help people understand how to make sure at least focusing in on the things that matter towards population change. And why is it so important that we think about this tale of two cities? We know, we've heard about growing inequality in terms of income. This is a paper done by Karl Jaworski at the Rutgers University. So since the 1970s, he's done it for every metropolitan region, looking at the disparity between income inequality and neighborhood inequality. So Baltimore is not necessarily unique, but we are on the top end of this kind of disparity. We have household inequality in the Baltimore region grew by 13%. The top halves in terms of income is now 13% greater than the last kind of quarter of the population. But neighborhood inequality grew by 25%. So we are sorting ourselves not only by income, but by place. And what does that mean from a place-based point of view? We know we have racial disparities. So in the city of Baltimore, the gap between life expectancy between black and white is 5 years. White is 76.6, and black is 71.6. We have a racial gap. We've got racial inequity in the city of Baltimore, absolutely. But we actually have a worse spatial gap. I'm going to take a look at two neighborhoods that have very similar demographics, and then look at their their life expectancy. We have two neighborhoods that are white, 64 and 65% white. One neighborhood has 73 years life expectancy, and another has 83 years. They're both 64% white. And we have two 93% African American neighborhoods. One is 66 years life expectancy, and the other one is 76 years life expectancy. They're both the same if you just looked at demographics. But because of space, there's actually a 10-year gap, even within two different racial groups, because of the places that they live. Anybody familiar with these neighborhoods? The 66 is Clifton Berea, which is not too far from here, and the 76 is Howard Park, way on the west side of town. If you've never been to these neighborhoods, I highly recommend just driving through, because you're going to see why these two life expectancy numbers are so different, because of the context that these neighborhoods are in. The first thing that you're going to notice about these two neighborhoods in particular is the disparity in vacant housing. The top line is Clifton Berea, which you can see is at that 25% rate, 3 times higher than the citywide average, and Howard Park is well below the citywide average for vacancy and lower than actually many neighborhoods. It's about 4%. Not a lot of vacancy in Howard Park, which means that they have all the things that you need, right? They've got a grocery store, they've got a bank, they've got all the other things that happen when you've got a stable neighborhood. In Clifton Berea, you've got so much vacancy that they're not getting all those other things that they need, including, the grocery store. So how about you? How many people live in a neighborhood with a lot of vacancy? All right, you're my soul soldier back there. How many people live in a neighborhood with not a lot of vacancy? Anybody not sure? When we think about privilege, we actually need to think about the places that we live that are contributing to those privileges. And the fact that you live in a neighborhood with not a lot of vacancy means that you get everything else. You get the grocery store, you get the functioning school, you get people moving in, you get a housing market, on and on and on and on and on, because of the place that you live, and you probably picked that place precisely because of that reason. When we did this, people in the room had not a lot of vacancy, but notice the not sure has gone down, right? It's pretty obvious if you see a lot of vacancy. It's not so obvious if you know if your neighborhood is growing or not. So that's why these indicators are there to get to that bigger issue that we can't possibly measure. And this is why vacancy is so important. We know that there's a threshold. This is a basic scatter plot, again, using our data around the neighborhoods that grew are in green, and the neighborhoods that did not grow between 2000 and 2010 are in red. And notice that no green dot goes beyond 4% vacancy, except for downtown, which is a little strange in a neighborhood. And so what we might consider 4% to be is a necessary condition for population growth. It's not sufficient, because you still see a couple of neighborhoods that are red below the 4% line. We have to deal with them, and I'll talk about them in a minute. But now we can start to set goals. It's kind of like when you go to the doctor's office and your doctor might tell you, hey, your hemoglobin level is not in range. Then you're going to do something about it to get your hemoglobin level in range. You're going to take an iron pill, you're going to eat more spinach, you're going to do something, right? Now we have something that we can tell neighborhoods what you might want to strive for. What's the goal of our planning? What's the goal of all the things that we're trying to achieve as a neighborhood? One thing that's tangible, make sure your vacancy rate stays below 4%. And so that becomes kind of an action plan, right? When we go into neighborhoods, it's not a global message. Well, there's one global message, make sure you stay or go down below 4%. But now you can have a tailored message to different neighborhoods. So we have these 6 neighborhoods in the city of Baltimore that have beyond 20% vacancy. Sandtown Winchester is one of them. You can see the third one down. Anybody know the last time Sandtown Winchester had a... Sandtown Winchester was famous, obviously, during the uprising here in Baltimore City. This is where Freddie Gray happened to be picked up that day. Anybody know when the last time Sandtown Winchester had a plan? Nobody knows. Yes.
Nehemiah housing plan.
Which was, do you know which decade that was in? The 90s. Sandtown Winchester has actually not even a plan from the 90s. It has an update to the urban renewal plan that was first originated in 1976. Sandtown Winchester has no vision of what it might even look like below 4%. That's obviously our number one recommendation, would be to make sure that we even have a vision for what these places might even look like. We all probably know what Port Covington's going to look like, right? We have a vision of, or somebody's vision of what Port Covington's going to look like. We have no vision of what Sandtown Winchester is going to look like, and then we wonder why nothing changes, right? Make sure all 6 of these neighborhoods have a plan, and that plan addresses this vacancy issue in some reasonable time frame. But I don't mean in the next 5 years. I mean in the next 30 years, right? We need a 30-year plan for these neighborhoods that we might change over time, but at least we have some vision of where they're headed. And for the middle vacancy neighborhoods, you gotta be vigilant to make sure that we either rehabilitate, demolish, do something that the community wants to make sure that they stay below 4%. So that's the number one thing we check for making sure that you can actually attract people into your neighborhood. The second one is the supply of housing. We've got a problem in the city of Baltimore and metropolitan places around the country around affordable housing. You've probably heard this in the news, but this is a data set that we get from HUD. We still get it, hopefully we'll continue to get it. Rate of housing voucher utilization. If anybody understands how housing vouchers are used, what it is if you are eligible, income eligible, you can then get on a wait list, it's a huge wait list, for a voucher, and you pay only 30% of your income, the voucher goes to the rest, and the voucher goes to the property owner, right? And the way it works in every metropolitan region is that there is a set, what's called metro area fair market rent. So that if you get a 2-bedroom, if you get a 3-bedroom, it is a set rent for the entire metropolitan area. That is not how real estate works for the rest of us. You can't go to any neighborhood and say, I want this 3-bedroom for $1,500. You can't go to Canton and say that. Well, a voucher holder is certainly never going to get a place in Canton because they can only get $1,500 for a 3-bedroom. So what happens? There's no voucher utilization in Canton. And in fact, what happens is that band of neighborhoods that are exactly at that voucher level is exactly where people go, right? If you're a voucher holder, you're going to try to get to the best neighborhood you can for $1,500 for a 3-bedroom. And if you're a property owner, you're not going to take it unless you can command $1,500. So it's kind of the upper bound for the voucher holder, lower bound for the property owner, and that's a very sweet spot. Bel Air Edison, McElderry Park, Washington Village, and Edmondson Village are the top 4 places in the city of Baltimore for housing voucher utilization. Why? Because they're at that price point. Notice they're not in the super vacant areas. If you have a voucher, that's the last neighborhood you're going to get to, right? The vacant neighborhoods don't have voucher utilization. Why? Because the voucher use is trying to get to a better neighborhood. They know that. What's fascinating though, those top 4 neighborhoods, so this is a data set that comes from HUD. This is a data set that comes from the census. It asks people how much they're spending on their rent. And we consider it to be unaffordable if you're spending more than 30% of your income on rent. Guess what the top 4 neighborhoods are for rent unaffordability? Bel Air Edison, McElroy Park, Washington Village, and Edmondson Village. This is an unintended consequence of the fact that our voucher use is not following the actual market, and the fact that not everybody who qualifies for a voucher gets a voucher. We have about 25,000 households every day that we know are on a voucher wait list. And because they don't get a voucher, they're struggling to stay in those same neighborhoods that are decent and affordable, like the 4 that I mentioned. And guess what? They're actually paying too much for their rent. If you have housing unaffordability in your neighborhood, and you're trying to sell something, like the Main Street on Bel Air Road, what do you got? You got a problem because people don't have disposable income to support that Main Street. So this indicator is what we tell every Main Street manager to track. Because if you've got rent unaffordability in your neighborhood, which Washington Village is also a Main Street, you're not going to get people to patron your Main Street, which also impacts kind of quality of life in your neighborhood. So notice that Edmondson Village also has a retail center, which is struggling. Why? Because people are paying too much of their income on rent. So this is kind of an ironic kind of conundrum, right? That the data is telling us, how can this irony exist? High housing voucher utilization and high rent unaffordability. So let's take a look at 2 neighborhoods, same way. What is going on in these renter neighborhoods that we must kind of address? So the top line, which is the green line, is Canton in terms of owner occupancy, and the blue line is Edmondson Village. They both are about 70%, or they started off in 2010 as owner occupancy, about 70%. Notice Canton has stayed at about 70, and Edmondson Village has come down a little bit below 65%. So it's come down a little bit, which means that they're getting more renters. Interesting in Edmondson Village. The fascinating thing, though, is that even though Edmondson Village is getting more renters, their rent unaffordability is actually going up. Because you have more and more demand for a slower and slower supply. Which is fascinating, because if you've gone to Edmondson Village, the average housing price is about $100,000. You could buy a property faster and cheaper. And so that is one of our biggest recommendations. Actually, I'll stop there for a second. So the point being that if we don't have a balance of renter and subsidized housing and homeowner in every neighborhood, we're going to get this squeeze in certain neighborhoods where some people are paying way too much of their income for kind of no reason, and then some neighborhoods are shut out, like Canton. It has 0 affordable housing usage right now. So think about your neighborhood. Are there realistic choices for people of any income to live in your neighborhood? Think about the housing stock. If you have variation in your housing stock, you're probably going to get variation in your income level, right? If you have apartments, if you have rent, if you have townhouses, if you get single family. How many people have realistic choices for any income level in your neighborhood? All right, that's a good thing. And how many people live in a neighborhood where it pretty much caters to one particular kind of income, whatever that income is? This is actually something you have control over as a neighborhood-based organization, to say, we actually want diversity in our housing stock, because you can actually get diversity in your income levels, which means that you can actually attract more people in the future to your neighborhood. Same thing when we did this with an audience of about 100 people. This idea that we only have housing options in our neighborhood for a certain type of income level is not a surprise. But again, think of it as a planner. This is literally what we plan, right? We zone for this kind of stuff, or we plan for this kind of stuff, and we build for this kind of stuff too, right? So this is kind of getting back to the recommendations. We have a suite of 3 recommendations to address this issue. And remember, there's never a silver bullet. It's always about looking at how things come together. So the small area fair market rent is what we're suggesting for the city. Instead of the metro-wide fair market rent, it would be a gradient of rent that goes with zip code or census tract. And other cities have adopted this with kind of great success. We're suggesting that the city of Baltimore and the metropolitan region adopt this as well. In those 4 neighborhoods, this is a very targeted neighborhood recommendation. we must focus on homeownership counseling and getting those renters that live there right now to actually move into homeownership. It's not a blanket statement about homeownership for the whole city, but we must focus on homeownership counseling and getting people into homeownership right now in those 4 neighborhoods that are actually affordable in terms of the market and not keep depressing the for-sale market. And if we think about what our real problems are in the city of Baltimore, we might talk about crime, we might talk about quality of education, but the real problem is that every day 25,000 people are housing insecure. Every day. These numbers dwarf our homicide numbers, they dwarf everything else. 25,000 people are on a wait list, and the wait list is actually closed. We don't even know how many people are waiting for quality, affordable housing in the city of Baltimore. If we don't address this issue, we're not going to be able to address all the other things that we care about. And the last one, transportation. Oh boy, transportation. Notice the pattern of neighborhoods that grew all along the blue. Notice the entire west side of Baltimore did not grow. There's a structural problem on the west side of Baltimore that the east side of Baltimore just doesn't have. And if we think about why this might be true, let's start looking at the networks that we have in the city of Baltimore. So this is that same map overlaid by the highway system. The highways are in red, and the metro system is in the hatch marked black. Literally every neighborhood is along some type of a highway. Why? Because if we think about neighborhoods as the muscles of the region, our transit and transportation system are the circulation and the arteries. And if you don't have circulation coming to your neighborhood, what are you going to do? If you don't have circulation coming to your muscle, what's going to happen? It's going to atrophy, right? The entire west side of Baltimore is essentially atrophy. Why? Because 695 Beltway, you just go around. Anybody see the movie Cars? Right? West Baltimore is Radiator Springs. So if you haven't seen Cars, it's this little town on Route 66, and the highway makes people go past Route 66 and not to the town to support the tire shop and the diner and all that stuff. West Baltimore literally is atrophying because we have no way to get there from our circulation system. Now, that's not to say that I recommend more highways. I obviously would recommend more transit, because right now, what our transit system is not a circulatory system. It's a line. Literally, it's telling us that unless we circulate, we're not going to keep getting blood into our neighborhoods. And when I mean blood, I mean people, right? Eyes. People driving through it is far better than nobody driving through it. And that is kind of an issue that we have with the west side of Baltimore that we have to address now. Now, how many people were involved in the red line planning process, which was a transit line that was going to go east-west? We as a city were involved in this planning process for 10 years. It got squashed by current Governor Hogan. And I don't see it coming back anytime soon with the federal administration lack of kind of transit planning and funding. So what do we do in the meantime? We must fix this, right? Otherwise it's going to continue to atrophy. And what are our low-cost, high-impact things that we can do right now? Anybody ever come in to the city from I-70 coming in from the west? So you're coming in on I-70, right? This major highway coming in the city of Baltimore. What happens when you get to 695? Anybody know? Okay, this is a field trip. I need you to all come in from Route 70, coming into the city of Baltimore, right? You're coming in off the major, going from San Francisco into Baltimore. You finally get here. What does it say? You go south to Glenburnie, you go north to Towson or New York.
Yeah.
Or straight is local access only.
If you go straight, no, it doesn't even say local access, it says parking right.
Yeah, true. Security Boulevard and Parking Ride. If you're on 70, you go up those things. Yep.
What do we need? We need a sign that says, "Welcome to Baltimore." Right? And how much does the sign cost? Nothing. Every single interchange around I-695 on the west side of Baltimore should say, "Go right into of Baltimore City who actually need wayfinding signs, we need signage, which is nothing in terms of kind of cost, and yet has such high impact. Morgan State Studio, we need wayfinding signs on the west side of Baltimore to get people to come in. And in fact, if you do this kind of anthropological thing, if you're coming down I-83, notice that there's signs for everything. Coppin State this way, Loyola this way. When you're coming in from Route 70, we don't even welcome people in the city of Baltimore. No signs. But maybe wayfinding would work there too. So the west side of Baltimore absolutely has a different trajectory than the east side of Baltimore because of its inaccessibility. Inaccessibility from literally a physical point of view, from our circulatory sense. So look at two different neighborhoods, and the relationship between accessibility and the thing that we care most about is getting people employed. These are two neighborhoods that are right next to each other. The top line is Southern Park Heights, and the dark blue line is Upton Druid Heights. Notice they start off at about the same time in terms of how many people travel more than 45 minutes to get to work. Southern Park Heights has only increased in that travel time, which is kind of fascinating. And Southern Park Heights is actually, Upton Druid Heights is actually decreasing. This is where State Center is. That travel time to work is the indicator that we use to talk about how inaccessible our city is. If you're in the middle of a city and you're traveling more than 45 minutes to get to work, that is not a quality of life feature, right? And you're not taking advantage of what urban areas are supposed to be about, right? Easy access to your job. These neighborhoods that have high travel time to work are actually our highest unemployment neighborhoods as well. So let's take a look at these two neighborhoods, the percent of the population that are unemployed. So in 2010, the blue bars, Southern Park Heights and Upton Druid Heights were not so far apart from each other. Of the 55 communities that we have, Southern Park Heights was ranked number 9th highest in terms of unemployment, and Upton Druid Heights was 13th. By 2016, even though you can see the difference grew between the two, notice the impact on unemployment. Southern Park Heights is now our 8th highest unemployment. Upton Druid Heights is now our 32nd. Huge decline in unemployment as well, because we fixed kind of an accessibility issue in that neighborhood. So, key recommendations around this topic. Obviously, we need to invest in high-quality transit, whatever we can do. We need workforce training programs that don't just train people for any job, but train people for proximate jobs. Actually really think about what are the sectors that are within 45 minutes of where you live right now, because what happens when we train people for jobs that are far away, what are we doing? We're actually incentivizing them to leave the neighborhood, and the neighborhood has just lost an employed person, or they might not reliably get to their job because it's so far away, and the neighborhood has retained an unemployed person, and that's what we're seeing in the data. And then this kind of maybe slightly silly, but I think potentially high impact finding about let's get people to come into the city of Baltimore from the west side and actually welcome them when they get here. So here's the message. We need policies that not only help people, but actually help the place itself. Just like that plant, you know that the answer is not in the leaf, the answer is in the soil. We are about the soil when we think about the built environment and we think about planning. This is all about the soil. We need to actually measure things that sometimes I don't even see in planning documents. How diverse is your housing stock? Is the population even changing? Sometimes I don't even see population change in some of our models. We need to look at occupancy. This is real estate 101. If you've got an occupancy problem, that's what's going to drive your future real estate. And we need to look at accessibility. So now these are actually a set of indicators that we give to every neighborhood to keep track of, because that's the context that you're in. And I invite you to do the same thing for your neighborhood now or after this talk. And this idea that it's okay to separate ourselves by neighborhoods is such an unequitable and unsustainable reality for our city. We cannot, if we think about kind of this from an equity lens, we cannot be neighborhoods that are separate but equal. I mean, yeah, we might be physically separate, but we cannot live like this where we truly have these unexpected kind of wild swings in our life outcomes just based on our address. We as planners can actually do something about that. And then there's a very key message to neighborhoods themselves, right? Not just a policy. Ask people, are people moving in or are people moving out? Invite them to figure out if this is a reality of their situation. They'll know. You go in a community, they know which houses are empty, they know why homes are not selling. Ask the real estate brokers that are in that neighborhood if there even are real estate brokers in the neighborhood. If you don't see any brokers in the neighborhood, you know you got a problem, right? Because there's nobody even trying to sell your neighborhood. And think about those things like marketing, which we talked about before. Our neighborhoods are essentially competing with every other neighborhood in the region. You, as a potential incomer into any neighborhood, have a choice, right? This is a basic economics TV model of neighborhoods competing against each other. And then we need to support barriers that actually prevent people from wanting to move into your neighborhood. And sometimes these are very esoteric, right? How can I get people in Sandtown, Winchester to agree to spend money that we have a sign at I-70? Because that's actually going to matter to them in ways that they might not think about from a proximate point of view, right? And what's the message to planners? So to all of you, my fellow planners, does the planning process even focus on population change? When you go into a community, do you even ask? Are people moving in or are people moving out? That's a simple question that you can ask, and imagine all the conversations that have come out of that, right? Do we provide communities with this kind of data? Because population change is actually a very difficult measure, very difficult data point to get, because we only get it at the time of the census. What strategies are we using to truly mitigate the daily work that it takes to get people to move into the neighborhood? And from an equity perspective, what is our vision for neighborhoods with respect to population change? I would suggest, this is a universal message, everybody, no matter what neighborhood you live in, wants people to move in. Everybody. And most of us just take it for chance. If the neighborhood has a for sale sign that goes up next door to you, do you actually think about who's moving in? No. Most of us don't. But imagine if communities got in front of that. Does Cousin Joe want to move in? Does your coworker that you like down the street invite them to move in? Actually get in front of who's moving in next door to you, because it matters, because that's going to be your neighborhood. And so what I have found out from this data, believe it or not, even though I'm a data geek, is that there truly could be a vision for all of our neighborhoods if every one of us takes both the responsibility and believes that we have the ability to welcome people into our neighborhood. And what would that mean if we truly got in front of that? I think it would be a Baltimore where anyone truly believes that they could live, work, or play in any neighborhood. And until Baltimore gets to that point, where all of us in this room believes that's true, and actually lives like that's true, we're not going to become an equitable city. And that's, I think, what the point of the data is. Thank you.
We have some questions if you'd like to ask some questions. Very provocative, far-reaching presentation. Please go ahead. I'll leave you some questions. Questions?
The question was, have we talked to the planning department about this response? Yes. I used to be the research chief for the city planning department. And what I should say that these recommendations are not just for community planners, right? If you're a transportation planner, if you're an environmental planner, we are building roads that literally deplete resources from neighborhoods. Please stop. If you're a transportation engineer, think about, is my planning even going to help make sure people move into every neighborhood and stop atrophying neighborhoods? Because that's a critical finding. So, yes. So here's the thing about where does this data go? And the planning department is actually just one stakeholder, right? It's got to go to the neighborhood, it's got to go to the elected official, it's got to go to the mayor's office, it's got to go to the planning department. It's got to actually be embedded in everything we do, so that it becomes a natural decision-making process. And what I found, which you probably have experienced as well in the last few years in particular, is that there are many, many people involved in the decision-making process. Even the planning department actually is not forefront in making these policy changes. It absolutely takes leadership, but in some cases, we actually need the neighborhoods to demand this. Santana Winchester doesn't even realize that they don't have a plan. Why? Because they've got so many other problems that they're dealing with on an immediate basis. To say, I need a master plan would be like, people are dying in my streets. Why would I even think to ask that? But, so it's kind of like you have to get to the minds and hearts of all kinds of stakeholders for something to actually change. This is not what makes the news. None of the recommendations that I put up here make the news. Right? Did I talk about crime? No. Did I talk about schools? No.
But
Because this is-
25,000 people on the wait list, that should make news.
That doesn't make the news. Exactly. This is the problem. We have 25,000 people on a wait list, and then we expect them to do well at work and do well at school and have a great home, and they can't even find housing. So, but it's the quiet thing that happens, right? So the answer to that is yes, we have talked to the Clayton department. I think it influences a little bit of what they do, but I will say that we have to influence way more people. All of you in the room in particular.
Great talk. Thank you very much. Could you possibly elaborate a little bit between the difference between accessibility and connectivity?
Good question. So the question is, what's the relationship between accessibility and connectivity? So I think our transportation and transit system provide the connectivity for accessibility. I think that's the way to think about it. But really, it can be anything that provides accessibility, right? Sometimes it's marketing. Sometimes it's just a welcoming atmosphere means it's accessible. The transit and transportation system is a physical connectivity, but there's also got to be social connectivity and kind of mental connectivity as well.
I guess the reason I'm asking this question is that it's one thing to put, as you're making a good point by showing that map that West Baltimore needs more highways, more cars to come in.
It needs eyes.
Eyes and also, well, it needs accessibility, right?
Yes,
Accessibility
yes, they are
can come-
inaccessible places.
It needs
yes.
roads, different kinds of roads, but it needs roads for accessibility. Now, the roads can be planted, but roads can also disconnect. So,
Yeah, absolutely.
So
Right.
how do we combat that issue? I mean, the classic example is the example of Westport. It could be so connected because there is a highway, there is a rail, there is a waterfront, there is everything there. But it is the most disconnected place from Baltimore. It's not because it lacks highways and it lacks roads or eyes, but there's so many other things that make it disconnected.
So I should clarify that the west side of Baltimore has plenty of roads. It's got Liberty Avenue, it's got Route 40, it's got Edmondson Avenue, but these are roads that we have essentially taken people away from through the use of the 695. So there's plenty of infrastructure in West Baltimore. It's just infrastructure that we no longer use to the capacity that they were built for because of other transportation plan and related things that we did to basically kill that, right? But the thing about accessibility is that, so we are on the East Coast. Every other East Coast city has a true metropolitan transit system. Every single one of those cities that I named actually has a full system, and you can circulate. You don't need to have a car if you live in DC or New York or Boston. You need to have a car here in the city of Baltimore. How do we get out of that? And maybe the fixed kind of transit system is a function of the 20th century, and maybe Baltimore can actually leapfrog right over that, the fixed rail system, and actually think about 21st century transit systems. And can we actually be bold and actually figure out how do we do this? So for example, in that 9th district, the housing stock is decent. It's got some vacancy issues, but it's relatively decent. It's actually got some beautiful homes that rival the ones that are in Reservoir Hill, for example. But nobody goes to Rosemont, which is the neighborhood that has these beautiful homes. It's in that 9th district, like I mentioned, that has every single neighborhood in the 9th district is declining. We're not going to get fixed rail anytime soon. We don't want highways down there anytime soon. We know that has other issues. What can we do in the meantime now that we're in the 21st century and leapfrog over other cities? Free Lyft and Uber if you either go into or come from the 9th district. what would happen? If you moved into the 9th district, you get free lift and Uber, you don't need to own a car, right? And if you're a business in the 9th district, and it's free lift and Uber to your business, what do you got? You got free marketing. Come to my pizza shop because it's free. Come to my barber shop because it's free. That's the kind of thinking that we have to do now in the absence, and it's not about the physical. We have plenty of physical connectivity. We need to repopulate these places to use the physical infrastructure that we have. And so that's the thing about thinking about how our policies might actually land in different neighborhoods. Like I mentioned, the homeownership kind of recommendation was for 4 specific areas. Let's have a targeted homeownership strategy in those 4 neighborhoods. Let's have a free lift and Uber in the 9th district. And let's actually make sure we have wayfinding signs for all of West Baltimore. And what are these? These are actually, I mean, the lift and Uber might cost a lot. Maybe you can have that as part of your studio too to see how much that would actually cost. But maybe we do it for 5 years to get people to just move in. Because what happens if we get people to move into the 9th district? The transit will come right beyond it. Because what do you have? You have transportation demand. All of our transportation models are looking for projections in population to look at future ridership. And we have to struggle to make sure that we can project future projections in that 9th district. Well, it's not there, but you have to induce that demand now so that when we do project, they're already there for the ridership that might come in the future. That's the kind of, to your point about, we actually have all the infrastructure here already. We need to really, maybe use 21st century technology to jazz it up. Yes?
So I think I see the value in the way you've analyzed all this data. And I think a lot of your recommendations are right on. The resources to get these things might be better. But there's another school of thought that says Americans vote with their feet, and there's a kind of playing out of people who have the means to move from lesser areas to better areas, and we see this in this kind of increased inequality by neighborhood. And I'm thinking perhaps Baltimore is not that different than other American cities, right? It's just maybe more extreme. Surely, if we looked at Philadelphia, which is a city that's stabilized, growing slightly now, and there's a lot of growth in certain neighborhoods in Philadelphia, we would see a kind of probably similar shaking out, right? So I'm wondering if any of these cities has taken these kinds of lessons to heart and are actually doing this, whether it be Philadelphia or St. Louis or Milwaukee, or maybe you could talk about what's going on in other cities that might be useful for us.
So to paraphrase Dan's question, are other cities experiencing similar things to Baltimore, even though they might actually be growing? I want every single one of you, no matter what city you might be focusing on, every single city in every single metropolitan area in the United States, whether the city is growing or not, has neighborhoods that are declining, stable, and growing. Everyone. Detroit actually has growing neighborhoods. New York has declining neighborhoods. Just on that one measure, population change. And if you think about, I actually would call on us to have a full research agenda around what is it that is causing distress in neighborhoods. And if it is truly that we start to see I know Baltimore really well. I think I kind of know some other cities well, but I know Baltimore really well because I'm staring at this data all the time. But I would challenge us all to really, when you read your planning journals, how many people even use population change to actually look at neighborhood change? I'm starting to read them and I'm like, you're not even using population change. We look at race, we look at income, we look at change in education, but we're not even looking at population change. So I call on us to actually look at this for other cities too. The impact of population loss, once a neighborhood has already been built out to whatever level that is, whether there are 500 people living there, 5,000 people living there, the contraction is a real problem. And so yes, we do vote with our feet, and so what do neighborhoods have to do? They've got to compete. They've actually got to compete. And they've got to track and get at this issue and nip it in the bud before something worse happens. And that's what the data is for, is to help us all understand as things change. Why do we go to the doctor every year when we might feel perfectly healthy? We want to make sure that there's not something we're missing, right? And that's the point of the data. We want to make sure that there's not something that we're missing, even though your neighborhood might look fine right now. But something is going to come up. Something maybe immediate, or something because we're building a road over there that might actually turn people away from you. You don't even realize, right? But if you're not monitoring that, you won't even notice that change. That's the point.
So I actually recently moved to Baltimore in May, and I find the city really fascinating from a planning and neighborhood standpoint. And I was curious if you have any quick recommendations about like the history of Baltimore from like a planning and neighborhood standpoint.
I recommend generally about 4 books. The first one is called That Old Neighborhood, which is by Ray Suarez. And it really talks about changes that occurred in the 1950s and how some of our Baltimore neighborhoods literally, people just fled overnight. And then, that's not to be confused with another book that's pretty popular called Not in My Neighborhood. So one is called That Old Neighborhood by Ray Suarez, and the other one is called Not in My Neighborhood by Ontario Piatola, who is a Baltimore Sun writer who wrote a fascinating kind of book around redlining in the city of Baltimore. And then if you haven't read William Julius Wilson's book, The Truly Disadvantaged, put it on the list. A great, unfortunate, terrible tale of de-industrialization in American cities, including Baltimore, and the effect that that had, especially in the 1970s. And then read anything by David Simon, like Homicide, which really describes the drug infestation in the city in the 1980s. Maybe these are already on your syllabi, but those are the ones I recommend.
So I was just curious, looking back at your map regarding like transit lines and highways, I'm just curious about a couple things. I think one, why Merrick Avenue is like the only expressway that you included, and also how you would explain the outliers, I suppose, like the fact that the Metro line goes through like Northwest Baltimore, but is still an area that's decreasing in population.
Which one did you say, the first one that I had up there that wasn't?
Moravia, one of the northeast that connects up near Morgan.
It's technically, that little piece is part of the federal highway system.
Well, that was my next question, is that is US 40 also part of the federal highway system?
Yes, that
Yes.
down in Morrill Park. So the question is, there are some outliers to this kind of finding. So, what the main point, which, and I'll get into your specific point in a second, the main point is that the only thing that's truly a circulatory system is our highway system. Our transit system is not a circulatory system, and because it doesn't truly circulate, it doesn't provide the benefits of a circulatory system. So you basically need to have a car to live in the city of Baltimore, pretty much, unfortunately. And if you're going to need a car, you're going to find some place there you can circulate. Because none of us live and eat, work, and play just in the city of Baltimore. We certainly don't do that in our own neighborhoods. You have to get to the airport at some point. You have to go to, Hunt Valley. You have to drive to Philadelphia. And so, Morrill Park, which is on that other side, actually doesn't have an interchange coming off of it, off of I-95 to get into Morrill Park. There's kind of a big gap between 395 and then Gainesville Avenue, so there's actually no accessibility onto the highway. One of the things that down in Brooklyn Curtis Bay, they actually want an interchange to be built there so that they could actually take advantage of the fact that they're right on 695. That might be potentially a recommendation for Morrill Park, but I don't know if that's necessarily what they want. They don't necessarily want like that kind of attention coming into Morrill. So that's like a conversation to have. But I think it's fascinating that we have this whole metro line that doesn't provide accessibility, even though the physical infrastructure is there. They're connected, but they're not accessible.
I would venture to add that a lot of the lines like we see here on the map are part of policies that are part of policies that were directed toward getting the communities in the north to the job centers in
In
the
the
South,
center,
like,
exactly.
like Baltimore City. So they were serving the communities, and I would dare say the majority communities, trying to make them have their convenience to getting toward the jobs and the places of employment.
Yes, absolutely. So the comment is basically that our transit system is all about in commutation, right, from the suburbs. It's not a neighborhood accessibility feature. Does anybody know where the Freddie Gray incident occurred and where the kind of the rioting happened that day? Anybody been down there? At Penn North. What's at Penn North? It's a metro station. So there were many people that were interviewed. Probably some of you were interviewed for reporters coming from all over the world. I met with who's a woman from MSNBC. She was doing a spot. We were standing in the shade of the metro stop at Penn North. And I was like, well, this is the metro stop right here. And she's like, in New York City, this would be $1 million homes, right? Because the metro stop is an accessibility feature. In Penn North, it's absolutely not. Because it doesn't circulate. There's just one line, right? So this is kind of I guess my call to my fellow planners is, think about it. I don't mean it to be simple, but I actually do think that this simplifies some of the things that we do. Go into a neighborhood, and if your planning process is not helping that neighborhood grow, or at least remain stable, even to remain stable, you need people to move in, right? Because there's some infrastructure, somebody's gonna pass away, somebody's gonna move away. If what we're doing is not making sure that more people are behind it to move into that, then we can build it, we can design it, but if nobody's gonna use it, that's never gonna change. Anybody know the story of Remington? Anybody been to our house? So let me tell you a quick story about Remington, and then we'll probably wrap it up. But Remington is Seawall Development Company, which is the T-Boo mannequin. At Donald Mannequin. Donald Mannequin was on the school board, and he noticed that 200 Teach for America teachers were coming into Baltimore City every year, because we have a hub for Teach for America into the Baltimore City public school system. 200 teachers coming in every year. What do you got? You got a market. You got a demand. A constant supply of demand. And so what they built was Union Mill, which is an apartment complex of about 40 units. And the common spaces are not, the billiard room, and they're not the pool. They built teaching rooms, like you have smart desks and you have copier machines and things like that would be useful to teachers. So they literally designed it to be marketable to a community of teachers. And then after 2 years from the Teach for America program, people said, well, we like the neighborhood a lot, we'd like to buy a house. And so they developed Remington, what's the row called? It's not Remington Row, but it's a different name. But they basically did single family housing from the row homes that were right across the street from so the people that were kind of graduating out of these apartments bought homes there. And then they said, okay, now what do you want? Well, we have no place to eat. So that's why they decided to do our house, which is now a place where neighborhood people can walk. And then they also didn't have any places to buy drugstores, so they created kind of Remington Row, which is where they have the retail on the bottom and the apartments on top. This is the new style of kind of conscientious neighborhood-based development, but it all stemmed from the fact that they have a faucet on of people that are going to be looking at that neighborhood to buy or rent. Every year, 200 people are going to look at that neighborhood. Every neighborhood should be thinking about what's their locational advantage to what kind of market. Every 21st century school that's coming in right now, we should be marketing to potential parents, right? Because we're going to have a brand new school. On and on and on and on. So how does your planning process address this? Is it not necessarily turning planning on its head, but it's like adding kind of a layer that's critical for the future. Thank you.
If you have further questions, you can kind of grab her for a moment and talk to her. Thanks for coming out. My class will meet in just a couple of minutes up in our classroom. You can also email Seema. Yeah, the contact information. Thank you again, Seema, for a very stimulating introduction.
That's our website.
Yeah, but I'm not, I'm aged out.